So today's topic, I entitled Shared Responsibility is Not Shared Risk. And I did that specifically because I do a lot of work in governance, risk, and compliance. And I see a lot of organizations that they turn to like a provider or an IT organization, or they go essentially across the wall, and they ask questions about risk. And the people that are on the answering side of that try to answer those questions, and they probably shouldn't. And so what I'm here today to talk about is that managing risk in an environment where we've got multiple providers and so on. So what I'm talking about cloud, of course. So let's get into that. So who am I? So as Chris indicated, I do nothing but consulting in governance, risk, and compliance. Iceberg Networks as a company does software implementation with a couple of the leading GRC products, but we don't have a product on our own. So I think it makes us very well suited to provide advice around how to do this sort of thing. Iceberg didn't start off to do governance, risk, and compliance. We actually started off to do risk management consulting. That was our raison d'etre. But around 2008 timeframe, I was doing work in compliance. And I was working with gigantic spreadsheets full of controls and inventories of things, and dealing with the morass that, as far as I'm aware, a lot of people are still dealing with that sort of thing. And at that point, we got introduced to governance, risk, and compliance software, and saw the light, so to speak. And around that time, we decided to shift the strategic focus of the company to be doing nothing but governance, risk, and compliance. And we've been doing that for about 10 years now. So as I say, I think we've got a lot of history under the belt now, and have learned a lot of lessons. I was on a course about a month ago, and the instructor of the course, in a little kind of classroom introduction thing, said, if you had a superpower, what would your superpower be? Do you want to be able to fly, or do you want to turn invisible or shape change or something like that? And when it came around to me, I said, I don't want a superpower. I've got a superpower. And so I told him that my superpower was that I can peel labels off of things. My wife thinks it's genius, but I don't think I'm ever going to make the X-Men. So as I think I talked a little bit about this, but what am I here to talk about? So I want to go through, what does the shared responsibility model actually look like? There's been a number of different kind of publications on the topic, and I want to go through a couple of the models that have been presented. There's a huge, I think, barrier in communications around the words that we use. And so I want to do a little bit of discussion around how we might do better communication around the topic of risk. And then, how do we actually manage the whole assurance posture? And so, in the government, that tends to be SANA. In private industry, there may be topics that are similar, but there's always the concept of, I want to make sure I'm secure. How do I do that? So there's some challenges in doing that. And then the model for managing the complexity of it. So I think this goes into the I have a dream. I'm a bit of a GRC geek, so I tend to think about how GRC might help the world. But I know what's going on right now in the world is digital transformation. So my digital transformation dream is, I want to be able to send my autonomous car out to go pick up my renewed passport and fishing license and bring them home so I can go off and do my things. That might be a little bit dumb, because if we really were fully transformed, you wouldn't need a paper passport or a fishing license. So what the heck? But that's probably why I shouldn't be managing your digital transformation portfolio. I should be helping you secure it. So digital transformation does, however, mean that people need to move faster. They need to adopt new technologies, new services, new models for delivery. And so in order to accomplish all of that and also manage risk at the same time, really requires organizations move quickly in certain areas. And I believe that GRC, governance, risk, and compliance, really needs to undergo that same digital transformation as the core services that an organization is delivering. I think if you have digital transformation of your services without figuring out how to manage risk faster and better, you will be in for a world of hurt. So I want to make the pitch for why there's better ways to do some of the security activities that people are doing today. So let's get into the whole concept of the shared responsibility. Has anybody, I'm assuming everybody's seen these kind of models that they've done cloud implementations and that sort of thing, so you've got a bit of an idea of what it looks like. So I'm going to start with a model that was, it's actually, this is not an exact scrape, but it's up on the Government of Canada website for the Protected Medium Cloud Profile. And so this is a model that's showing there are different mechanisms for absorbing services. And so there's the infrastructure as a service, platform, software as a service, and everybody's got models that actually have very similar shapes to this, where as you move up the stack, you tend to push responsibility for things down to the organization that's doing the service delivery. And so this is, it's building up a bit of a picture of, it starts with a physical infrastructure, moves into the, to the hardware software that's delivering it. At some point, they all talk about an abstraction layer. And the abstraction layer becomes, I think, really important because this is where the client really first interacts with the organization. And there's this really strong hope that everything they're interacting with below the abstraction layer, that they really don't need to worry about terribly much. I think there's, some of that is kind of true, but some of it also is not true. And I think there's the activities that you would normally do around securing an infrastructure really don't go away. You don't lose the responsibility for ensuring that things are in place. What you do, though, is have the ability to ensure they're in place through a contract mechanism, rather than ensuring they're in place through actual expenditures on security technologies and resources and so on. But the idea is that you have certain technology elements that you're responsible for, technology elements that the provider is responsible for, and you, as I say, kind of cross your fingers that across that contract relationship that you've thought of everything. So I want to go to a model that's, I think, a little bit more detailed. You have a question? It's actually on the canada.ca site. I've got a link later on in the presentation. I can show you, where it came from. As I say, I took slight liberties with the diagram, but and I'm going to take even more liberties with this. Okay, so this is Amazon's picture of shared responsibility. So this, if you haven't seen it, this came from the AWS, some of the information site for the Amazon Web Services. And this is how Amazon sees their services and your consumption of their services. So they've got a pretty strong model here where we have Amazon is, they say they're responsible for security of the cloud. And so they kind of detail out what they mean by cloud and all that. So that's great. Then we go up to the customer side, and Amazon says the customer is responsible for security in the cloud. And that's kind of an interesting statement. But if you look at the different layers that they've put in there, it all sort of makes sense. So it starts at the top with the actual data. So this is obviously customer data. They own it. They're responsible for it. They're responsible for its safekeeping. So that's great. And then we get into identity and access management. Yeah, another one that clearly the client is typically going to be responsible for that. Amazon may provide technologies that help with that, but the actual processes are customer focused. And then we get into the the different layers and down into the software and compute storage and so on. I've got a little sidebar on database. Does anybody other than me see database as just a storage abstraction? Okay, so it's so I don't know why it gets called out specifically. I think because it typically has a lot of granular access control capabilities, and so it's treated a little bit differently. But anyway, that's, as I say, a bit of a sidebar there. So I want to get into now, what does shared responsibility mean? And from my perspective, I can equate responsibility with controls. So if you think about, back to my topic is managing risk. Most people don't manage risk, they manage controls. And so if you've got responsibility for managing risk, you want to make sure that you've told people underneath you what the controls are that you're expecting to be in place. So it's already sort of a shift in language. What I've done here is I've taken controls from the ITSG 33 or NIST SB 800-53, depending on which one you want to refer to, taken the control families and tried to slot them into the shared responsibility model. The first bottom layer here, where I've got, I just blanked out here. Technology failure. All right, let's hope that doesn't happen again. At the bottom layer, Amazon themselves says, controls that you can inherit from us are physical security controls. So they're very explicit. These are the only controls where you can fully inherit them. That's kind of interesting. They don't actually make very many assertions about the security then of the product above that. But I think there's a lot of reason for that. And the next few controls, the system integrity, awareness and training, and that sort of thing, those are actually control families that Amazon themselves calls out and says that these are shared controls. And I kind of like that picture because they actually don't call out system integrity, they call out patching. They say patching is a shared responsibility. And yeah, because actually if you buy EC2 from Amazon, you're responsible for managing the updates on the software. So that's kind of cool. But they do provide tools for doing that sort of thing. So those are nice shared responsibilities. I was kind of questioning awareness and training, but what they say about that is that they train their own people and they train their people in security. And so, okay, I'll buy that. So then what I did is I said, well, where do the controls above that layer fit? And so I started slotting in, this is me taking like enormous liberties with the families of controls and hoping people forgive me for that. But I started slotting in the different control families as to where the customer may be responsible for them. And like it or not, I placed them into the different layers. And one of the things that the astute will notice is that there are some control families missing. And so this is really the crux of my argument, is that nowhere in here does anybody ever say anything about risk. What they're talking about is security and controls and vulnerabilities. And so they're talking about all of the elements of risk. They're not talking about risk itself. And so I thought, aha, here's an opportunity to expand the model a little bit. And so that's what I'm doing. And so I said, well, where does risk really lie in that model? And risk should lie at the product and services layer. So if I'm doing digital transformation, what I'm really trying to do is offer a new service, or I'm trying to transform an existing service into a digital version of that. And so where the service lies in the Amazon model is off the top. It doesn't even exist. And so that service, I modeled it out as product and service at the top layer. And then we have our staff that operate it. And so this is the first line of defense, or the operational staff that are providing the sort of the people behind the man in the machine, the people that are behind the service. And what they're doing is they're delivering some sort of business service. And so this is actually, if you ever look at GRC tools and how they model out a infrastructure, they tend to treat the CMDB with all of the IT infrastructure as just kind of, oh, that's the CMDB. Yet, it's a super important topic from a security perspective, but where GRC really wants to get to is the business context. And the business context is found at the business process and that business service that you're delivering. And so so you ask the question around even things like, SANA, when somebody is asked to authorize something going into service, they're typically authorizing not just some information system, but they're typically authorizing a whole service all at once. Yes?
So the glaring thing that's sort of gnawing in the back of my mind during this is that, the realities of supply chain attack, but the realities of incident response, there's an entire layer of the platform there which we don't have much visibility to assurance or reporting. 10 years ago when, the CA conference was all about the emergence of, cloud and, you should be considering going to the cloud. The question at the time was, okay, but if there is an impact, if there's an incident at that yellow layer, what's the method of disclosure? What's the responsibility or requirements for disclosure? Where does it go? How is the visibility there? How do we get there? It doesn't look like in the last decade that's really been answered in that bottom yellow section, because there's controls and software that apply to the hypervisor, compute, storage, database, networking that don't seem to have requirements for controls a lot of things.
That you're like absolutely feeding into my dream world. And that's and so I think the question is around, how do we get visibility across that contractual boundary into all of the controls that are underneath? And I know it's actually a very challenging problem. I'd like to present what I think a solution could be, but I will also declare that nobody's ever implemented it. So I think what you're talking about is, okay, we've got this, I'll call it a bit of a dream world about how it may all fit together. And there are the tools potentially available, but it's simply not been implemented. And I'll get into some of the reasons why it perhaps hasn't been implemented. I'll try to keep that in mind as I get into the next part of this. If I go back to this model though and say, okay, this is now really good. I've been able to add some additional control families to my model. Means that I've now got a much more complete picture, and I've actually found somebody who's responsible for risk. And so now I've got the product and services owner, and this in IT vernacular is typically called the business. I use the air quotes because it's a very generic term but very common. And so the business is responsible for managing risk. They're responsible for managing risk of their product and service. They're not really all that concerned about the details underneath that. They really just want to be able to ask the question, what is my risk? What is the exposure I'm accepting when I decide to authorize this? I do want to point out that, again, for the astute, there are still some control families missing. And so that's where I want to do one more build on this and say, well, in order to really get to a complete picture, I need to go even higher still. There's a control family, the PM family, that is not typically always included in the way people do their kind of control library management. And the PM family is program management, and it's all about the security program. So what I've done is I've said, well, in order to get to a model where I can say all of my controls are now modeled out, I've got a home for them, what I needed to do is add the really very top layer where I get into corporate governance. And so now what I've done is I've gone from kind of security and vulnerability up into risk, but I'm still at the operational risk thread, but I've traced it now all the way up into enterprise risk. So now I've got people that are concerned about how some exposure may impact my business. And it's not just my business as a service, but my whole portfolio of services. And so I think it's important to have this kind of visibility whenever you're talking about risk. And I think this is where the problem really starts to come into it. So, not having such great luck with technology right now. So I think this is all very nice. It's a model that we can use when we look at how a service is pieced together out of piece parts where I've got my own infrastructure, I've got cloud infrastructure, I've got my own people, I've got business processes that work over top of it. But it's really, it's never all that simple. And so what we're looking at here is, this is from a Microsoft publication for Office 365. And this is from a FedRAMP document. So FedRAMP lines, obviously, the NIST control families out to how private sector deals with them, specifically around cloud. So what Microsoft had to do in order to satisfy that, there was, I'll call it FedRAMP compliance, or at least FedRAMP kind of knowledge, in their services is they built this authorization boundary diagram for Office 365. And I think this is, I would hate to be the guy that needed to draw this. I would hate even more to try to trace risk through this. But the fact is that each one of those boxes is some sort of system, and each one of those lines is some interaction between systems. And so you're going to have, for every one of those lines, every one of those boxes, you need to understand what controls do I have for the lines, what am I transferring across the boundary between these systems? It's the data flow, it's the, and I'm going to, start to use terms like it's the risk flow. I'm pushing risk up into the system, up into the top layer somehow, and I need to push controls back down through the same kind of model. So it can get very complicated. I think there's a bit of a nice thing, though, is that it's not just a morass. It's not just a cloud that's amorphous. It actually does have boxes around it. So this is the starting point of how I believe that GRC and how the way you manage this can really start to work. Is that if I say, well, it's a giant diagram, it's going to be hard to take care of all of that, but let's start here. And we'll start with one little piece of this and really build a big picture of what controls this piece has, what it's delivering, what data is flowing in and out. There's other people presenting on topics like micro compartmentalization and on boundary layers and being able to set up zones and that sort of thing. And those are all examples of this sort of thing where you're really trying to get down to a building block where you can understand the whole context of the building block. And it's not just the technology concept, it's the risk concept associated with that building block. It's hard to get it really to risk because there's some key elements of risk missing from the picture when you're down at that building block layer, but it's at least possible to understand vulnerability. It's possible to understand exposure and where you may have gaps. So as I say, the modeling can be complex, but if you take that kind of systematic approach to it, you get to the point where you can start to build up the picture again. So let's talk about problem number 2 in this, which is control selection. I think that the government of Canada, in copying NIST, did a wonderful thing. Back when I was doing spreadsheet-based control management, there was this statement that you need to manage the baseline security controls for the government of Canada. Okay, can you please hand me that list? And the answer is it didn't exist. It was a suite of policy and standard documents where you needed to read through the document and try to unpack the words and figure out what controls it was talking about. So back when I was doing that kind of work, I said, could we please just take FSMA, scratch out United States, write in Canada, scratch out OMB, write in Treasury Board, and then pass it through Parliament. And then we'll just feed a little bit of money into NIST because they do great work on the documentation side of this. It didn't happen the way I wanted, but I think with the introduction of ITSG 33, we came up with a really terrific thing for the government. What it didn't help all that much was private sector. It didn't help the cloud providers all that much. It helps a little bit because of the strong alignment between the NIST and the Canadian framework. And so that means things like if you've done FedRAMP as a cloud provider, you're probably going to fit nicely into the Canadian world. But there's some differences. And so let's go through why control selection is a problem. First is that on the FedRAMP side, the NIST and the sort of FedRAMP organization have really left it up to the cloud provider to determine what controls they're implementing. It's a good thing because it means that you can go through explicitly and state for this control, we are doing X, Y, Z, and the client is expected to do ABC in order to have full control implementation. So in that regard, the FedRAMP framework is really nice. When I get down, I'm going to skip down to the government of Canada. So the government has published a protected B medium cloud profile. Again, I think that's really nice. One of the big things they did is they went through and said, well, for protected B medium, we need the following controls to be in place. And these are the following ones where we have expectations of a cloud provider. So the ability to map out, what the cloud provider is to do and what the customer is to do is kind of already spelled out. And so, as I say, I think that's terrific. But the cloud providers have other problems to deal with. They don't just have government as a customer. They've got, they may be offering services that are handling payments, and they're using payment cards. So there's no way they can just do FedRAMP or ITSG 33. They need to do PCI DSS. And so now they've got a control family that really, yes, okay, there's a crosswalk to the NIST control family, but it's something that you need to manage on its own. The test and evidence requirements of PCI are very different from the test and evidence requirements of the other frameworks. If you're handling financial transactions as a service provider, like as an outsourcer, you need these SOC controls. And again, you need to get audited against that. You needed a report out on how you're doing against the SOC 1, SOC 2. And none of it actually lines up all that well. And you start to throw in the compliance requirement on top of risk management, and it goes absolutely haywire. As a Canadian bank, especially any of our big banks that have a footprint also outside of Canada, they're regulated by OSFI and the OCC and by Canadian privacy laws. Oh, it's not Canadian, it's every province has their own privacy laws. And it's also, every jurisdiction they go into is going to have another set of things they need to comply with. And all of those in my world are controls that need to be implemented. And so this is, as I say, it's a bit of a morass. It's a really tough to manage part of the picture. So let's dive into the next part of the picture, and then we'll elevate ourselves back up. So the next problem I see is the whole thing around risk terminology. And so we've talked a little bit about controls, and so I go to my business and I say, I've got an issue with my identity and access controls. And the business says, oh, what's the risk? And then the control guy goes back and he tries to figure out, well, okay, I think it's a severe vulnerability, so I'm gonna rate the risk high. And the business says, high risk, oh my gosh, what are we gonna do about that? That whole conversation shouldn't have happened, because the risk really is something where the business should understand what risks, and there should be not a whole pile of them, but what are the actual risks of exposure? What is my risk of fraud? What is my risk of some sort of information breach due to hacker or other kinds of activities? I want to be able to elevate my risk discussion up to those kinds of concepts. So when I've got an issue down at my control layer, the issue is not a risk on its own. The issue is an input into risk. And so I have this slide that talks about the gap. So what is my risk? I think your risk is X. It should have been, what is the severity of the vulnerability? Oh, it's a high severity vulnerability. And so if it's a high severity vulnerability, which of my known risks has that now elevated? The known risk is, oh, this is risk of breach due to fraud activities. Okay, so I've elevated it above my threshold of tolerance. I therefore want to do something about that particular control. So if somehow we could get the language to move away from vulnerability, severity, and issue and those sorts of things and up into the risk, we would actually have a conversation that made sense to everyone. And that's where I think there's a good book on risk management. And I refer to this particular formula a lot. I'm assuming everybody in the room, or most of the people, have seen this somewhere. And this is out of the Harmonized Threat Risk Assessment Methodology. And this is a fantastic model, because what it does is it breaks down risk into the major building blocks of risk. I've got asset value. Oh, I've got an issue that's elevating my asset value. Great, what are we going to do about that? I've got an issue that's increasing my threat exposure. Hole in the firewall. Yeah.
Actually, I'm curious, because in the world of ITSG 33 and over the half decade, it's been identified as the next government silver bullet for security, right? Part of the marketing up front was, you don't have to worry about risk management. Or threat and risk assessments. You don't need it as part of this model. So I'm actually wondering how many people in the room have seen this equation before.
Yeah.
So a little more than half, okay.
Okay.
Because I find it interesting as part of the presentations we're hearing this week with the vendors I'm talking to, there's a, you really should be considering this, whereas at the time ITSG 33 was perhaps sold as a solution comparable to SANA,
Yeah.
that, hey, this is going to be easier, this is going to be more routine.
Well, I think if you look at ITSG 33, we all talk about the control library part of it. What we tend to overlook is the fact that it has a risk management framework in it. So I think, yes, it does help. I like this particular equation because it says, okay, asset value, threat environment, vulnerability. And then when I talk about the control world, anytime I have a failed control, I can equate that to a vulnerability. And so it's this very straight line between, the control world, vulnerability, possibly threat management, and rarely asset value. So it means that you can generally equate issues to one of those either vulnerability or threat elements of risk. But it means that you need to have now kind of a risk library, as opposed to saying, what is the risk, and trying to develop it from the ground up. You should be able to do this from the top down. So let's look at a little bit of what I see as the solution. I'm hoping to present more than just what the problems are. And as a guy who works with RSA Archer a lot, which is a GRC product, I'm obviously very interested in that. But I also do work with other GRC products. And I thought, let's start with somebody else's model for GRC. And so this was a model for GRC that was published by an academic group out of Portugal, I believe. And I really like this because it's a reference model. It shows me what the data elements of managing risks should look like. And I think this is really cool because right there I can say, they even called out that issue and risk are not the same thing, that they're separate objects. And they have control as separate from each one of those things. And policy is controls relate to policies. And policy, gets derived from laws and regulations and so on. And so this is a really interesting diagram because it basically pieces together all of those elements that we were talking about. And what I really glean from this myself, and I don't know if anybody else does, is that if you tried to put this in a spreadsheet, you can't. Because what it is a relational data model that essentially each one of those items would need to be a tab in a spreadsheet. And so you would have I didn't count them, there's 25 objects up there. You'd need 25 tabs, and somehow you'd need to build cross-references between the rows in your control spreadsheet with the rows in the issue spreadsheet with the rows in the risk spreadsheet. And oh my gosh, that's a big job to do. And so this is where the GRC tools have evolved from, is that they've recognized that trying to manage things like SRTM, okay, that's a control list. I can do that in a spreadsheet. But now trying to build a POAM from that, I need to refer back to my spreadsheet and I can't put it in the same spreadsheet. And so just that one thing on its own has created a tooling problem. And so this is where, as I say, I think the GRC tools really help with that kind of picture. Another one that I like a lot, but I've never found a use for, is the Unified Compliance Framework. And so does anybody know UCF? Okay, it's a bit of an American thing, so it's not well adopted in Canada. But what they did is they've taken hundreds of regulations and standards and mapped them through to a common control library. The problem is that the common control library is their own. It doesn't actually relate to any kind of pre-existing proven framework. So I believe the UCF, their model is terrific. The actual output and the controls themselves are hard to adopt. You would have difficulty saying I'm compliant with the controls for ITSG 33 because I'm doing UCF. But as I say, it's got some nice things about it. It takes the authority documents, the regulations and standards and so on, and ultimately maps them up to something they call controls. and then has the idea of audit and testing of controls and that kind of thing. And then this is, I think this is more specific to the Archer product. And so this is how they've implemented it. There's something that they have policy management where they get down to the clauses or the provisions of a policy that relates to a screen going off. I don't know if it's the cable or what the story is. It's come back up a couple of times and seems to not be right now. There we go. But then it gives you the ability to relate what becomes your control library. Oh, nice. Oh, it's going to start flashing, even better. I knew I shouldn't have used my own laptop. Fully seated, okay. Well, let's hope it holds up. I'll flash through the rest of the slides so you can memorize them. Anyway, so the idea here is that you create your own control library, and you have the ability now to say, okay, I'm going to assign these controls. I'm going to allocate these controls to this system. I'm going to test these controls, and so it's a tool that has implemented what is fundamentally that reference model. This is my dream world. This is the question you asked about, is how do we get communications of what's going on across that contractual boundary? Oh, well, we're just going to federate everybody's GRC tools. If everybody had a GRC tool, that'd be fantastic. But the idea here is that we don't even need people all using the same control libraries. What we need is that crosswalk. We need the ability to say, if you've done PCI and have those controls in place and demonstrated to the satisfaction of an inspector, then we should be able to say, oh, that means that you've got SC7 in place. And so I want you to tell me that you've got it. I want you to show me through evidence how that control is in place. And if there's any issues with that control, I just want you to tell me about it. And so what that should be able to do is have the ability for us to manage our service at the top layer. Everybody's spreadsheets, everybody's GRC tools feed up into that picture. And so now if I have a control failure, it gets bubbled up to the top, and I can say, okay, I've got a control failure. It's a medium severity vulnerability. It's related to the following risk, and therefore the risk has elevated from low to moderate. But I'm still okay with moderate, so I'm not going to do anything about it. Or I'm sort of okay, let's make sure the plan to resolve is going to happen fast enough so my time horizon on the risk exposure is managed. So as I say, there's this world where you need the tool in order to manage all of these elements. And if we were then able to digitally transform the GRC world, we would be able to have not just the abstraction layer of the cloud provider. The abstraction layer would include some kind of feed up of the things they're responsible for, and you would be able to then calculate how it impacts your risk. So that's the major elements of what we're dealing with. One of the things that the GRC tools do is deal with the fact that people manage risk at multiple layers. You do risk management as risk management, but you do control testing and audit as something else. You do business continuity, business impact assessment and business continuity management on its own. You do, I'm gonna lose track of what all the other things are, but you do all of these risk management activities. They've all got something in common. They all say, I've assessed that this risk exists, and I've given you some sort of an estimate of how big the risk is, and I've put a plan in place to fix it. So they all have this identified risk, plan to resolve, or plan to treat the risk. They've all got that exactly in common. So why don't they talk to each other? Why does the guy writing the TRA say, oh, I need the PIA before I can finish my TRA? But the guy doing the PIA says, oh, I need your TRA before I can finish my PIA. It's like, you're talking about the same thing, risk. And yes, they're different kinds of risks, but we really should be able to abstract risk up to a more common business level discussion. So the GRC tools do a lot more, but I think the major thing I'm here to pitch is that the whole world of managing risk across that contractual boundary relies on specific kinds of information, and we really need people talking the same language in order to bring that to a risk type discussion. So I think the big problem of, the total amount of data it can amount in, the more I do micro compartmentalization, the worse my problem gets, because typically control mapping is what's referred to as an n-squared problem, where the more things you introduce, it doesn't just multiply the number of things you introduced, it multiplies by some power of the number of things you introduced. So I think I'm going to wrap there.